The Silver Birch was the kind of restaurant where everything gleamed, from the polished crystal chandeliers to the uniforms of the waitstaff. Hidden in a wealthy Moscow neighborhood, it catered to politicians, CEOs, celebrities, and their well-dressed families. It wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place to be seen. That night, the dining hall was buzzing. The clink of wine glasses, soft classical music, and laughter filled the air. At table 14, however, silence hung heavily. She sat still, a small girl, no older than 11. Her skin was deep ebony, her eyes dark and wide, staring down at her untouched plate of caviar and salmon tartare. Her posture was perfect. Too perfect for a child. People glanced at her. And then, whispered. She was the only black child in the room. The only one in a sea of pale faces and diamond necklaces. But it wasn't just that. She hadn't spoken a word all night. Is she lost? A woman muttered to her husband. Maybe she's a charity case someone brought in. A man sneered. Playing savior again, I see. At the table with her sat a wealthy Russian couple, the Petrovskys. Mr. Petrovsky was a steel magnate. His wife, thin and pale with a diamond choker that cost more than most apartments in the city, sat beside him, scowling. Why did we bring her? She hissed in Russian. She doesn't talk. Doesn't smile. She's embarrassing. She's just shy. He mumbled, clearly uncomfortable. She's been through things. She doesn't even understand us. The girl blinked, her hands folded in her lap. Silent. Still. A waiter came by, bowing slightly. Everything to your liking, sir? Mr. Petrovsky nodded curtly. But as the waiter turned to the girl, he hesitated. Then leaned slightly toward her and asked, gently, Would you like something else to eat, miss? The girl didn't respond. Her eyes flicked toward the waiter, then back down to her plate. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The waiter smiled awkwardly and walked off. From another table, someone laughed. She's mute, maybe. A young woman joked loudly. Or maybe she thinks she's too good for us. Snickers followed. And then came the first cruel voice. A teenage boy, smug and bored, said in perfect Russian. Look at her. Probably doesn't even know where she is. Africa is calling. Laughter. Sharper this time. Crueler. The girl flinched. Just slightly. Almost invisibly. But someone saw it. Not someone at her table. Someone across the room. A maid. Her name was Angela. She wore a crisp black and white uniform, her hair tucked neatly under a scarf. As one, she moved quietly through the room, clearing glasses, folding napkins, always invisible, always ignored. But not by the girl. Angela had noticed her the moment she entered the restaurant. Not because she was black. That was rare here, yes, but not impossible. No, Angela noticed her eyes. They held something she remembered. Fear. And control. The same look Angela had worn when she first arrived in Moscow 10 years ago. She'd come from Côte d'Ivoire with a suitcase, fluent in French and her native bet, but not a word of Russian. She had cleaned offices by day and scrubbed kitchen floors by night. Now she worked at the Silver Birch. Step up, they said. But tonight she saw herself in that little girl. So when the laughter spread like a virus across the dining room, Angela paused mid-step. She turned toward table 14 just as the boy, some rich diplomat's son, tossed another casual insult. Maybe if we clap, she'll do a trick. More laughter. A fork clanged onto a plate. The girl said nothing, but her jaw clenched. Her fingers curled slowly, white-knuckled. Angela had seen that expression before too. In herself. On nights when she had to swallow every insult just to survive. She looked around. Nobody, not even the Petrovskys, defended the girl. Angela stepped back into the shadows. Not yet. Not here. But she watched. Across the restaurant, a tall man entered through the private elevator. He wore a dark suit, no tie. His presence alone turned heads. Waiters straightened their backs. One even dropped a tray. Nikolai Antonov, CEO of Antonov Technologies. Worth billions. Rumor had it he dined at Silver Birch once a month. Always alone. Always at table 1. Tonight he paused. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning until they landed, not on his reserved seat, but on the small girl at table 14. She didn't notice him. But he noticed her. His brow furrowed. Then he walked silently to his table, signaled for his usual server, and sat down, watching. At table 14, the whispers had turned to open mockery. "She doesn't belong here," a woman said behind her. "You know what I heard?" another voice chimed in. "Petrovsky adopted her. Some PR stunt. She probably doesn't even speak Russian. They just brought her to look diverse." Even Mrs. Petrovsky rolled her eyes and pushed her wine glass forward. "Useless. Can't even pretend to be normal." The girl blinked rapidly. Her eyes glistened. Then she stood up. The room quieted. It wasn't loud. But somehow her movement stopped everyone mid-bite. She stepped back from the table. Her lips parted. And still, she said nothing. Until someone behind her sneered. "Do you even understand what we're saying, Devushka?" The girl turned. And for the first time all night, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but clear. Soft, accented, not with African intonation as they expected, but crisp, deliberate, and unmistakably Russian. "Yes. I understand everything." You could hear the knives freeze mid-cut. Forks hovered. Glasses paused on their way to lips. Someone gasped. The teenager who had made the last joke, pale now, laughed nervously. "Wait, what? Did she just?" But the girl wasn't done. She turned slowly, scanning the room. Looking each face in the eye, the ones who had laughed, whispered, sneered. And then she spoke again. "I didn't speak because none of you deserved my voice." It was like a shot fired in a cathedral. Mrs. Petrovsky's wine glass tipped, spilling red across the white linen. A waiter dropped a spoon. Somewhere in the back, a man whispered, "She speaks Russian better than my niece." The silence turned heavy, now not from discomfort, but from shame. Angela stood frozen by the pillars. Her heart was thudding in her chest. She had dreamed of saying those words herself 1,000 times. But she never had. This little girl just did. She felt her throat tighten. Across the room, Nikolai Antonov hadn't moved. But now he leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the child like she was a puzzle piece he didn't know he'd been missing. At table 14, Mr. Petrovsky looked like he'd swallowed a nail. You speak Russian?" he asked in disbelief. The girl turned her gaze to him, her face emotionless. "I am fluent in 5 languages, including Russian." Even Mrs. Petrovsky blinked. 5? The girl nodded. "Russian, French, English, Arabic, and Swahili." And then, for the first time that night, she smiled. But it wasn't a child's smile. It was the calm, dangerous smile of someone who had endured too much and decided never to let it break her. Nikolai Antonov stood up. The servers noticed first and scurried. But he didn't call for food. He walked straight across the restaurant. All eyes followed him, from tycoons to their wives, from the boy with the insult to the girls in designer dresses. He stopped at table 14 and looked down at the girl. Then, without a word, he turned to Mrs. Petrovsky. "She's not your daughter, is she?" The woman straightened. "No, but we've been hosting her. A temporary arrangement. Charity, really." "Charity," he repeated, his tone dry. "You humiliated a child for being quiet. You surrounded her with wolves and expected gratitude." Mr. Petrovsky stood up now. Nikolai, let's not turn this into. But Antonov raised a hand and turned back to the girl. What's your name? She looked up at him, measured him, then answered. Imani. The word rolled off her tongue like silk. It means faith, she added, in Swahili. Antonov smiled for the first time. Then, without asking anyone else, he turned to her and said, Come. You're sitting with me now. The room watched in stunned silence as Imani stood, straightened her dress, and walked beside the most powerful man in the building. No hesitation. No fear. Angela, still frozen near the service station, felt a wave of warmth rise in her chest. Like someone had opened a door she never believed existed. Imani passed table 9, the one with the boy who had joked about Africa, and gave him a single look. He looked down, red creeping up his cheeks. At table 1, Nikolai pulled out a chair for her himself. She sat with quiet dignity. No awkwardness. No nervous glances. She didn't fiddle with her napkin or look to the Petrovskys for approval. She belonged there. And everyone felt it. A waiter rushed over. Antonov glanced at the menu once and ordered for both of them, grilled sea bass with lemon risotto, and apple tart tatin for dessert. Then he folded his hands. So, Imani, he said gently. Where are you from? Imani looked up. Originally? Dakar. Senegal. He nodded. And how long have you been in Moscow? 6 months. Did the Petrovskys adopt you? She shook her head. They were hosting me. For a program. Gifted international students. But once the press left, so did their kindness. Her voice was calm. Almost too calm for a child. Antonov didn't speak for a long moment. He studied her face. They treated you like a trophy. She nodded. And discarded me when I didn't smile for them. Across the restaurant, whispers had turned to silence again. Not out of mockery, but all. A few people who had laughed earlier now avoided her gaze. Others looked at each other, ashamed. The woman who had mocked her accent earlier quietly stood and left, leaving her glass of wine untouched. At table 14, the Petrovskys sat stiffly. Mrs. Petrovsky grabbed her clutch and muttered, Let's go. But Mr. Petrovsky hesitated. He looked at Imani, now seated at the CEO's table, and a flicker of regret crossed his eyes. He had seen strength before. In boardrooms. In war rooms. But never in a child. Angela couldn't stay hidden anymore. She stepped forward from the shadows and approached table 1. Quietly. Nikolai looked up as she neared. May I? She hesitated. May I say something? He gestured for her to continue. Angela turned to Imani and spoke in French. Tu es la plus courageuse que j'ai jamais vue. You are the bravest I've ever seen. Imani's eyes widened. Vous parlez français? You speak French? Angela nodded, smiling. Et un peu de russe. Et anglais. But French is the language of my soul. Imani gave her the first real smile she had smiled all night. Soft. Grateful. Human. Angela bent slightly, whispering. You reminded me who I used to be. Antonov looked between them, something changing in his eyes. Angela, he said thoughtfully, you're not a cleaner anymore. Starting tomorrow, you're my new cultural liaison. You speak 4 languages, yes? Angela blinked. Then nodded, stunned. 5, sir. He smiled. Make it 6. We'll pay for the classes. By now, the entire restaurant had changed. The tables once filled with gossip were now silent with reflection. Even the pianist had softened his tune, letting his fingers drift into a somber, uncertain melody. At table 1, Imani sipped warm tea. She looked smaller now, not because she was shrinking, but because she was finally able to breathe. She had no need to sit tall, silent, armored. Her words had done more than posture ever could. Nikolai leaned in slightly. Imani, if you don't mind me asking, where are your real parents? She paused. Her gaze fell to the table for a moment. Then she whispered, My mother died when I was 5. My father sent me away. He thought he was protecting me. But the school that took me in, it was run like a factory. Numbers. Scores. No voices. Just survival. Nikolai didn't interrupt. I was top of my class. That's why the program selected me to study in Russia. To be their pride. Their little genius in the East. Her voice turned bitter for just a moment. They wanted a story, not a child. He exhaled slowly, letting her words sit in the space between them. Then he said, I don't want to be another person who collects you. I want to offer you a place to grow. She looked up. What do you mean? I fund a foundation for gifted youth. Not for press. For real change. Real mentorship. It's not adoption. It's opportunity. Education, safety, travel, resources, and people who listen. Imani stared at him. Her hands trembled slightly. Why me? Because you've already taught this room something no one else ever could. He smiled. And because I believe Russia needs more girls like you at the table. At every table. Near the back, Angela stood quietly, watching. She had been offered a new title, but something deeper had shifted in her. Years of swallowing her identity just to survive, and now this girl had lit a fire in her. One she wouldn't let go out again. As dessert arrived, Imani looked around the restaurant. So grand, so cold, so sharp-edged just an hour ago. Now, it felt different. Some patrons approached. Quietly. Awkwardly. A woman who had once laughed now knelt beside her chair. I'm sorry, she whispered. We were wrong. Imani simply nodded. There was no pride in her eyes. No cruelty. Only a tired kind of wisdom most children were never meant to carry. When the evening ended, Antonov walked her to the private elevator. Angela followed a few steps behind, holding a folder that now contained her new employment contract. As the doors opened, Imani turned. She looked back once more at the dining hall, where once she had sat silent, alone, foreign. And now, she left as the most powerful voice in the room. Epilogue 1 year later. A glossy photo appeared in a major international magazine. Youngest speaker at United Nations Youth Forum, Imani Diallo, age 12. Behind her on stage stood Angela, now wearing a blazer instead of an apron. And in the audience, front row, sat Nikolai Antonov. Silent. Proud. And beside him, several of the same diplomats and elites who had once mocked her. Now listening. Because Imani had taught them something no title, money, or power ever could. She taught them that presence isn't proven by volume, but by truth. And that sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one whose voice the world has been waiting for.